She just wanted to rest after a long journey. A female veteran fell asleep in the forest with her dog and woke up next to something the Army had been hiding for 15 years. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are from. The forest was still, wrapped in the kind of silence that made even the smallest sounds, water dripping from a leaf, the crunch of gravel underfoot, seem amplified. It was the kind of place where time did not pass in hours, but in breaths. Mary Ellis moved through it with the steady rhythm of someone who had learned to walk without thinking, without purpose other than forward. Her boots sank softly into the damp soil, leaving faint impressions that the earth swallowed almost immediately. She carried only what she needed: a worn rucksack, a rolled sleeping mat, a tin cup, and the black shepherd that trotted beside her, its movements measured and alert. Ranger's fur glistened faintly in the muted light that filtered through the canopy, his ears turning with each whisper of wind. He was the only creature she trusted, the only one who had stayed. It had been years since she left anything that could be called a home. There had been apartments, bare, temporary ones, with creaking radiators and old coffee stains on the countertops. But she had never stayed long enough for them to smell like her. The city had become a maze of noise and light she could no longer bear. Crowds were the hardest. The sudden laughter of strangers, the metallic echo of subway brakes, the smell of cheap perfume and hot concrete, all of it pressed against her chest until breathing became a conscious effort. Out here, among the trees, the air felt clean, thin, honest. Her right knee ached sometimes, a small souvenir from Afghanistan, where the ground had once given way beneath her in a cloud of dust and metal. The scar still ran like a pale seam down her leg, stiff when it rained. But the ache no longer bothered her. It was proof she had survived. Ranger, too, bore his own scars, a faint white line across his flank from shrapnel that had grazed him during a night raid. They were bound by the same ghosts, the same sound of distant explosions that had turned into the same need for silence. The trail curved downward toward the sound of running water. Mary slowed, scanning the landscape with the cautious instinct that had never left her. The forest here was old. The trees were broad and heavy, their roots gripping the soil like clenched fists. The smell was rich earth, moss, the faint sweetness of decay. She saw remnants of other travelers, an old campfire reduced to ash, a strip of faded canvas tangled in branches, a dented can half buried in mud. People passed through here, but not often. That comforted her. She didn't want witnesses to her solitude. As the day stretched toward its golden end, the light shifted. Shafts of sunlight filtered through the leaves, turning the air into a haze of gold and green. Ranger trotted ahead, stopping now and then to sniff at something unseen. Once, he gave a low growl toward the underbrush, and Mary instinctively rested her hand on her holster. She waited. Nothing moved except a rabbit darting across the path. "Easy," she murmured, though the word was more for herself than for the dog. The tension in her shoulders eased, and she resumed walking. By late afternoon, she found the river. It wound quietly through the forest, its surface a mirror that caught the fading light. Smooth stones lined the banks, and the water moved over them with a soft, perpetual whisper. On the opposite side, she saw a massive oak, so wide that two people with outstretched arms couldn't have encircled it. Its trunk was hollow, the opening large enough to crawl inside. The bark was dark and ridged, like ancient skin, and one of its roots extended toward the river like a gnarled arm reaching for a drink. The place felt strangely inviting, as though it had been waiting. Mary dropped her pack and walked closer. The air inside the hollow was cool and dry, carrying the faint scent of earth and sap. She ran her hand along the inner wall. It was smooth, polished by time and rain. "Looks like a room made by patience," she whispered. Ranger sniffed the ground, tail low, circling once before settling near the entrance. It would do. She unrolled her mat inside, laid her sleeping bag atop it, and stepped out to gather a few dry branches for a fire. The flames took quickly. She fed them slowly, the crackle echoing against the low murmur of the river. The light from the fire flickered across the oak's bark, making it seem alive, breathing. She brewed coffee in her small tin pot and ate a ration bar she'd been saving since morning. The taste was bland, but the warmth of the drink spread through her chest. For a while, she simply sat there, knees drawn to her chest, watching the fire reflect in the water. As night settled, her thoughts began to wander, uninvited, but familiar. She remembered the base where she had met Ranger, the way the desert wind carried sand into every crease of her uniform. She remembered her unit, the noise of laughter in the mess tent before everything went wrong. It wasn't the explosions or the gunfire she recalled most vividly. It was the silence afterward. That thick, suffocating quiet when you realized who wasn't answering the radio anymore. Some people called that peace. She called it the sound of the world closing in. Ranger shifted closer, resting his head on her leg. His eyes caught the firelight, gleaming like amber. "You remember too, don't you?" she asked softly. The dog's ears twitched in response. She stroked his head absently, staring into the flames. Out here, the past came without invitation. It rose like fog, wrapping around her, until she could almost smell the dust of old battlefields. When the fire had burned low, she added another log. The crackle was comforting, but there was something else beneath it, a faint hum, perhaps the whisper of wind through the trees. It seemed to come from the oak itself, as if the tree exhaled. She smiled at her own foolishness. "Talking trees," she murmured. "That's new." Still, she felt a strange pull toward it, a heaviness that was not entirely unpleasant. Eventually, she lay down on her mat, the hollow of the tree curving protectively around her. The last thing she saw before closing her eyes was Ranger lying near the entrance, his silhouette outlined against the fading fire. Sleep came slowly, a cautious visitor she rarely entertained. But tonight, it arrived quietly, wrapping her in a warmth she hadn't known in years. Sometime deep in the night, a low growl rumbled from Ranger's throat. Mary's eyes snapped open. The fire outside had burned down to embers, casting long, weak shadows across the ground. The air was cooler now, damp with the river's breath. She listened. The forest held its breath too. Another growl, sharper this time. She reached instinctively for her pistol, the motion as natural as breathing. Sliding out of the hollow, she scanned the darkness with her flashlight. The beam cut through mist and branches, but revealed nothing but trees and the shimmer of water. Her heart beat faster than it should have. Old reflexes. She switched off the light, letting her eyes adjust. Silence pressed in again. Dense. Absolute. She turned back toward the oak and froze. The ring of stones she had arranged for the fire now looked different. The pattern was too neat, too deliberate. Someone or something had moved them while she slept. She crouched, examining the stones. They formed a perfect circle now, symmetrical in a way she hadn't made them. The embers glowed faintly inside it, breathing like coals in a forge. Her pulse slowed as a strange calm washed over her. The sense of threat faded, replaced by something else. A feeling that she was standing inside a memory, not her own. She could almost sense presences, faint outlines in the dark. The hair on her arms rose, not in fear, but in recognition. She whispered into the stillness. "If this is your place, I mean no harm." Her voice was barely audible above the rustle of leaves. The forest offered no reply, yet the air seemed to shift slightly, as though acknowledging her. Ranger stepped closer, pressing against her leg, his tail low but no longer tense. She sat beside the dying fire until dawn, unable to shake the sensation that she was being watched, not by eyes, but by the land itself. When the first light broke through the trees, the unease had turned into something else entirely, an odd sense of belonging. By morning, she gathered her gear and boiled water for coffee again, watching the steam rise into the cool air. The stones of the fire pit remained in their perfect circle. She didn't move them. Some things weren't meant to be disturbed. She looked at the oak's vast, ancient trunk, the hollow that had sheltered her, and felt an inexplicable gratitude. The world around her was unchanged, yet she knew, deep in her bones, that she had stepped into something she could not yet name. As Ranger drank from the river, she reached out to touch the bark once more. It was warm under her palm. For the first time in years, she whispered a kind of prayer, not to God, but to the ground itself. "Thank you," she said quietly. Then she sat down, poured the last of her coffee into the soil, and watched as it darkened the earth, sinking into the roots. The sun climbed slowly, scattering light through the branches, and Mary leaned back against the tree, closing her eyes. For a long time she listened to the river, to Ranger's breathing, to the deep, patient silence of the forest. It was not an empty silence. It was the kind that waited. And somewhere, beneath the surface of things, she felt that the waiting was for her. The next morning came softly, as if the forest itself were reluctant to wake. Mist drifted along the river like breath, curling between the trees and dissolving into light. Mary stirred in her sleeping bag, blinking at the pale blue sky visible through the oak's opening. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then the smell of damp earth and burnt wood grounded her. The oak, the fire, the circle of stones that still lay in perfect symmetry. Ranger was already awake, his ears pricked toward the riverbank, nose twitching at something buried beneath the roots. She rose slowly, her muscles stiff from the cold ground. The air was crisp enough to sting her lungs when she inhaled. Ranger gave a short bark and pawed at the dirt, scattering wet leaves. "What is it, boy?" she asked, rubbing sleep from her eyes. When she crouched beside him, she saw the edge of something metallic, dull, square, and partially swallowed by soil. It wasn't a rock. She brushed the dirt away, her heartbeat quickening with each movement, until her fingers uncovered the corner of a box, wrapped in what looked like decayed olive fabric. It took effort to pull it free. The fabric tore easily, exposing rusted clasps and the faint imprint of a stenciled word. She leaned closer. The letters were nearly erased, but she could still read them. Echo 3. For a long time she didn't move. That name, that word. It belonged to a part of her life she had buried as deep as the box itself. Echo 3 was her unit, the one that had disappeared 15 years ago in a classified operation no one spoke of afterward. She had believed she was the only one who made it back. But here, in the middle of nowhere, their ghost had surfaced. Her hands trembled as she worked the clasps open. The hinges creaked, reluctant, like a throat remembering how to speak. Inside were bundles of old paper sealed in plastic, a few black and white photographs, a compass, a dog tag tangled in a cord, and a folded piece of cloth that had once been a map. Everything smelled faintly of oil and time. She pulled out the photographs first. They were grainy but familiar, a small group of soldiers posing in front of a tent, squinting against desert sunlight. And there, just behind a younger version of herself, stood Captain Jonathan Jones. He was laughing, his hand raised in mock salute, the same sharp line of his jaw, the same eyes she remembered closing when they told her he was dead. But if the box was here, in this forest, thousands of miles from where they'd last seen each other, then something about the story she'd been told had never been true. Mary spread the map across her knees. The paper was worn thin, the ink bleeding at the folds, but she recognized the markings: coded coordinates, drop zones, rally points. A red circle marked the very spot where she sat. Someone had drawn it deliberately, and next to it, in faint pencil, a single word: stay. She folded the map carefully, her thoughts racing. Who buried this? She whispered. And why here? The forest offered no answers. Ranger lay beside her now, head resting on his paws, watching her with patient eyes. As the sun climbed higher, Mary wandered along the edge of the clearing, following the river upstream. The water was shallow, running over flat stones, its sound constant, unchanging. She scanned the ground for more signs of human presence. Footprints, old metal, anything, but found only moss and roots. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't the first to return here. The earth itself seemed disturbed, as though it had been opened and closed many times before. Back at the Oak, she built a new fire, smaller than the night before. She boiled water for coffee, hands steady now, but her mind refused to rest. She studied the dog tag she'd found in the box. The letters were still legible despite corrosion. Sergeant R. Hayes. She knew that name. He'd been in her unit too, a quiet man from Kentucky who played guitar on the long nights when the desert wind wouldn't let them sleep. He had died during extraction, at least that was what she'd been told. So why was his tag here? That night she stayed close to the fire, unable to shake the unease that settled in her chest. Ranger paced around the perimeter, stopping often to listen. Every few minutes he'd lift his head, nostrils flaring toward the dark. Mary tried to read the letters again, but the light from the fire danced over the pages, blurring the words. They were written in a tone she recognized, the dry, factual rhythm of a soldier recording orders, but there were undertones of fear. The last entry read, "Hold the line. If we're compromised, scatter north. The drop is here. Burn the rest." She closed her eyes and saw the desert again, the broken horizon, the sudden flare of a rocket, the confusion of shouting through static. She remembered the moment they lost radio contact, the brief flash of Captain Jones waving them to retreat, the explosion that turned night to glass. When she woke in the medic tent 3 days later, they told her he was gone. Now, sitting by a fire beside a river in Virginia, she could almost hear his voice again. Sleep came and went in fragments, dreams blurred with memory, faces half seen, voices overlapping, Ranger's bark cutting through the dark. When she opened her eyes again, dawn had returned, washing the trees in gold. She felt hollow, as if the forest had reached inside her and taken something away. She decided to search farther. Following Ranger's lead, she crossed the river at a shallow bend and climbed a low ridge. There, among fallen branches, she found what looked like the remains of a campsite long abandoned. Canvas shreds clung to a branch, and a piece of twisted metal half buried in dirt caught the light. She knelt, brushed it clean. It was a drone wing, small, old, military grade, the kind they used for reconnaissance. On the metal was a barely visible serial number, starting with E3 by. Her pulse thudded. This wasn't coincidence. This place had once been theirs. The forest grew denser the farther she went. Vines tangled around trunks like veins, and the air smelled of rain though no clouds hung overhead. At one point, she thought she heard someone walking parallel to her through the brush, but when she stopped, the sound stopped too. She waited, counted her breaths, then turned back toward camp. Ranger stayed close, tail low, silent except for the occasional huff through his nose. By the time she reached the oak again, the sky had dimmed. The fire pit from the night before was cold. She crouched to relight it and froze. The stones had shifted again. Not many, but enough to notice. They formed an almost perfect circle, smaller than before, as if closing in on the ashes. She didn't touch them. Instead, she retrieved the radio she'd found inside the box, a compact military transceiver, its casing scratched, but intact. She hadn't dared turn it on earlier, but now the impulse felt irresistible. It took her an hour to clean and connect it to a battery pack. When she pressed the switch, a low hum filled the air. Static crackled faintly through the speaker. She adjusted the dial, searching through dead frequencies, until a faint tone rose, a rhythmic pulse like a heartbeat. Then a voice, distant and distorted, broke through. "If anyone hears this, Echo 3, do you copy? This is..." The rest dissolved into static. Mary froze. The voice was older, rougher than she remembered, but familiar all the same. "Jones," she whispered. The radio hissed, then cleared for a second. "If you're out there, reply, please." Her throat tightened. She gripped the microphone. "This is Mary Ellis, Echo 2, she said, her voice trembling. "I hear you." Static swallowed her words. A pause followed, long enough that she thought she'd imagined it all. Then the voice returned, fainter, but clear. "I knew you'd find it. The tree remembers." And then nothing. The silence that followed felt heavier than any sound. Mary sat perfectly still, the radio warm in her hand. Ranger leaned against her leg, sensing the tremor that ran through her. She stared into the dark forest beyond the river, where mist was already forming again. "The tree remembers," she repeated under her breath, unsure whether it was a message or a warning. When dawn came, she didn't pack. She stayed near the oak, watching light shift through its branches. The world had tilted in some quiet, irreversible way. The place no longer felt just like a refuge. It felt like a threshold between what was remembered and what refused to die. She set the radio carefully beside her and whispered, "If you're still out there, I'll wait." The forest answered with wind through the leaves, a low murmur like breath. Ranger lifted his head, gazing toward the ridge as if expecting movement. Mary followed his gaze and thought, for just a heartbeat, she saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, tall, still, familiar. When she blinked, it was gone. The wind shifted, carrying the faintest scent of smoke, and she realized it wasn't over. The past wasn't buried. It was calling her back. The morning was different. The forest no longer felt like a quiet bystander, but like something awake, aware, holding its breath. Mist lifted slowly from the river, curling through shafts of pale sunlight that filtered through the branches. Mary sat by the oak, the radio still beside her, its surface cool and silent. She had not slept. Her thoughts circled endlessly around the voice that had come through the night before. Rough, strained, but unmistakable. It had been Jones, her captain, the man she had mourned and buried in memory 15 years ago. And he had said, "The tree remembers." The phrase wouldn't leave her. It echoed in her head with the same rhythm as the river's pulse. She poured the last of her coffee into the tin mug, sipped, and felt the bitter warmth spread through her chest. Ranger sat near the water's edge, watching something across the river, his tail low, his gaze fixed. Every now and then, his ears would twitch, and he would emit a quiet, uncertain sound, halfway between a growl and a whine. "Do you see him too?" she whispered. The dog didn't move, only tilted his head slightly as if to say yes. Around noon, the sound of an engine drifted through the trees, faint and uneven, carried on the wind like a ghost of machinery. Mary froze, listening. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was unmistakable. The deep, uneven cough of an old vehicle climbing the dirt road from the valley. She rose, her hand instinctively brushing the pistol at her hip, and Ranger straightened, muscles tense. A moment later, a dusty truck emerged between the trees, its engine sputtering before falling silent. The door creaked open. A man stepped out, moving slowly, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. His hair was gray, his shoulders broader than she remembered, but bent with age. He wore an old army jacket faded almost to green-gray, the fabric threadbare at the elbows. When he lifted his head, she saw his face, and for a heartbeat, the years folded in on themselves. Captain Jonathan Jones was standing before her, alive. Neither of them spoke at first. They only looked at each other, as though afraid the other might vanish if they blinked. Finally, Jones smiled faintly, a weary curve of his lips. "You found it," he said. His voice was rougher than before, but it carried the same calm authority that had once steadied her through chaos. "I knew the place would call someone back." Mary took a step forward, her throat tight. "They told us you were dead," he nodded. "They told me the same about you." The silence that followed was heavy but not uncomfortable. Ranger approached cautiously, sniffed the air around Jones, then relaxed, as if he too recognized something beyond scent. Jones knelt with difficulty, resting a hand on the dog's head. "Good boy," he murmured. "You were always the smart one." Mary gestured toward the fire pit. "You'd better sit before you fall," she said. Jones chuckled, lowering himself onto a log. She rolled closer. She handed him her canteen, and he drank deeply, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. For a long while they didn't speak. The river filled the silence, steady and indifferent. Only when he looked toward the oak, his eyes softening, did he begin to explain. "I came back here after the operation," he said quietly. "After everything went wrong, Command wrote us off. They needed a clean story, something the press wouldn't question. They said we'd been lost overseas, all 6 of us. But I didn't die there. The evac team pulled me out 2 days later. By then, I was already a ghost." He paused, staring at the water as if it held the rest of his memories. "They sent me home under a different name, said I'd never wear the uniform again. But there were things left undone, promises made in places like this." He gestured toward the oak. "This was our last base before we were cut off. We buried the records here. The truth of what happened. And the others. Some didn't make it. Some tried to come back." Mary listened without interrupting, each word stitching together fragments she had carried for years without context. "You buried the box," she said finally. He nodded. "I thought if anyone ever found it, they'd know we weren't the monsters the reports made us out to be. That we didn't run." Mary's hands tightened around her knees. "I found the map, the circle, the word stay." "That was for me," he said, smiling faintly. "I left it in case I ever had the courage to return. Took me longer than I expected." They sat together until the sun began to dip behind the trees, the sky turning a deep, bruised blue. The fire crackled softly between them, its light flickering over their faces. When Jones spoke again, his voice was quieter. "Do you still have his tag?" She looked up sharply. "Whose?" "Hayes. I saw it in your hand when you opened the box." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the worn tag, running her thumb over the engraved letters. "I kept it," she said. "He was with us that last night. I thought he was killed in the blast." Jones's gaze dropped to the fire. "He was. I stayed long enough to bury what was left. That's when I decided to hide the rest here." He exhaled slowly, the sound trembling like a sigh. "I've been trying to find peace with it ever since. But you can't make peace with ghosts unless you give them somewhere to rest." His words settled over her like the weight of truth. Mary looked at the ground beneath her boots, at the roots that seemed to pulse faintly in the firelight. "Then let's finish it," she said. Jones met her eyes, nodded once, and together they began to dig. The soil was soft and dark, filled with the scent of old rain. Ranger watched silently, occasionally sniffing at the edges of the growing hole. They worked until sweat darkened their clothes, and their breaths came ragged. When the pit was deep enough, Mary lowered the box back inside the letters, the photos, the maps. Jones added the tag from his own chain, and together they covered it, the earth falling softly, soundlessly, like a closing heartbeat. Jones placed a small metal plaque on top, something he had carried in his pocket all these years. The engraving caught the last light of the fire. To those who stood here, not as soldiers, but as witnesses. They stood side by side as the sun disappeared, the river turning to liquid gold before dimming into gray. For the first time in years, Mary felt no need to move on, no restless urge to walk, to escape. The silence between them was no longer an emptiness, but a kind of completion. When Jones finally spoke, his voice was almost tender. "You know, this place could be more than a grave. It could be a beginning." She looked at him questioningly. "For people like us," he said, "those who came back, but never really returned, they need somewhere to come and remember without shame, without uniforms, without lies." Mary glanced around the river, the trees, the great oak standing like a sentry against time. She imagined a small shelter here, a fire burning each night, veterans coming one by one, sitting in quiet, not to speak of war, but to learn to breathe again. "A home," she said softly. Jones smiled. "A refuge." They began planning in fragments, how to clear the ground, how to bring wood, how to reach the nearest town for supplies. But as darkness settled and the stars appeared above, their words drifted into silence again, replaced by the steady rhythm of the forest. Later, when Jones fell asleep near the fire, Mary remained awake, watching the embers pulse and fade. Ranger lay with his head in her lap, his breathing deep and even. She traced the lines of the oak's bark with her fingers. It felt alive, warm, as though it truly remembered the hands that had once leaned against it, the voices that had whispered in the night. She thought of all the years she had spent wandering, searching for peace in motion, never realizing it was still here, waiting. The realization filled her with a calm she hadn't known since before the war. By dawn, a soft rain began to fall. The air smelled of wet leaves and new beginnings. Jones woke slowly, stretching stiffly, and smiled at her through the drizzle. "Looks like the place approves," he said. She laughed quietly, the sound surprising even herself. "Then we'd better get started." They worked through the morning, gathering fallen branches, tying ropes between trees, sketching outlines in the mud for what would become the shelter. It wasn't much, just enough for a roof and a wall against the wind, but it felt right. Each strike of her hammer, each knot tied, seemed to drive away another ghost. By evening, a rough frame stood beside the oak, half sheltered under its vast branches. Mary stood back, mud streaked across her arms, and looked at what they'd built. It wasn't finished, but it was enough to begin. "This will be their place," she said softly. Jones nodded, his eyes reflecting the glow of the rekindled fire. "And yours?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. As the night deepened, the rain stopped, leaving the air washed clean. They sat by the river, watching the current carry fallen leaves downstream. Ranger lay between them, content. The forest hummed quietly around them, alive with the sounds of crickets and the slow breath of wind through branches. Mary looked up at the stars through the gaps in the canopy and felt, for the first time, the simple weight of belonging. Not to a country, not to a uniform, but to the earth beneath her boots and the silence that no longer frightened her. Jones rose with effort, resting his hand on her shoulder. "I'll bring more supplies in spring," he said. "There are others who need this. You keep it safe till then." She nodded, understanding. When he left the next morning, the truck's engine faded into the distance until it became indistinguishable from the rustle of trees. Mary stood at the riverbank long after he was gone, watching the road disappear behind a veil of mist. Ranger pressed against her side, and she rested a hand on his head. The oak loomed behind her, massive and patient, its leaves trembling in the wind. She turned back to it and smiled faintly. "You kept your promise," she whispered. That night, she sat by the fire once more, her back against the tree's trunk. The flames reflected in the river, painting the water in shades of copper and gold. Ranger lay beside her, his steady breathing merging with the rhythm of the river. She listened to the forest, to the quiet hum of life returning, and thought she could almost hear a voice carried on the wind, not words, but a feeling. Gratitude. Peace. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the fire and the heartbeat of the earth lull her. The war was over. The ghosts had been buried, but their memory lived not in pain, but in the place itself. When she finally spoke, it was barely a whisper. "I'm home." The river flowed on, the fire burned low, and above them, the ancient oak stood watch, its roots deep in the soil that remembered everything and forgave it all. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch the next video and explore other stories waiting on the channel, and share this one with someone who still believes that every place holds a memory worth keeping.